Have you ever stared at your phone and asked yourself one painful question? If they still care, then why does it feel like they've already disappeared? Not just physically, emotionally, spiritually, like the version of them that once reached for you, missed you, needed you, is just gone. And the worst part is, you can't even fully prove it, because avoidants rarely leave in a way that gives you clean answers. They leave in fragments, in distance, in silence, in colder replies, in energy that slowly stops choosing you. And if you stay until the end of this video, you're going to understand the one truth most people realize too late, the exact shift that reveals when an avoidant is not just pulling away, but emotionally gone for good. And once you see it clearly, you will stop blaming yourself for a love that was already slipping through your hands. Because this is where so many people get trapped. Not in the breakup itself, but in the space after it. That space where nothing is fully clear, where there is no clean ending, no final truth, no sentence you can hold in your hand and say, okay, now I know. Instead, you get confusion, mixed memories, old chemistry, lingering hope. You replay their words, you replay their warmth, you replay who they used to be when they were close, open, soft, present. And your mind starts doing what hurt minds always do. It begins building stories to protect your heart from reality. Maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they're scared, maybe they need time, maybe they still love me but don't know how to show it. And for a while those stories feel comforting, but eventually they become a prison. Because hope can heal you, but false hope can destroy you. That is the part nobody talks about enough. Sometimes the reason you cannot move on is not because the connection was so deep. Sometimes it is because your nervous system is still addicted to the possibility of resolution. You are not just missing them. You are missing the ending your heart thought it deserved. You are grieving conversations that never happened, effort that never came, accountability that never arrived. And when someone is avoidant, this becomes even more painful, because avoidants often leave behind emotional smoke instead of emotional truth. They don't always slam the door. Sometimes they just stop opening it, slowly, quietly, in a way that makes you question your own instincts, and that confusion can become dangerous, because the longer you sit in uncertainty, the more likely you are to betray yourself just to keep hope alive. You start lowering your standards without realizing it. You start calling crumbs progress. You start celebrating the smallest signs of attention like they mean everything. A random like, a delayed reply, a short check-in, a half-hearted return. And because your heart is starving, even emotional scraps begin to feel like a feast. That is what emotional deprivation does. It changes your definition of love. It makes inconsistency feel meaningful. It makes distance feel mysterious. It makes pain feel romantic. And before you know it, you are no longer asking, is this healthy for me? You are only asking, is there still a chance? That is where people lose themselves. Because when someone is avoidant, there is often one devastating reality you don't want to face. They may have started leaving long before they actually left, long before the silence, long before the withdrawal, long before the coldness became obvious. In many cases, avoidants detach internally first. They begin creating emotional distance inside themselves while still keeping some form of connection alive on the outside. And this is why the experience feels so brutal to the person left behind. Because by the time you start panicking, they may have already been shutting down for weeks, maybe months. While you were still trying to understand the shift, they were already adapting to life with less of you in it. And that realization can break something inside you. Not because they left, but because you start seeing that you may have been fighting for someone who was already emotionally gone while still standing in front of you. That is what hurts the most. Not just abandonment, but delayed awareness. The pain of discovering too late that the relationship you were trying to save may have already ended inside them before you even knew there was a war. And if you've ever felt that, if you've ever looked back and thought, wait, when did they stop loving me out loud? Then you know exactly how cruel this kind of pain can be. Because now it's not just heartbreak, now it's self-doubt. Now your mind starts turning against you. You begin wondering if you missed signs, if you asked for too much, if you were too emotional, too available, too honest, too intense, too loving, too real. And this is where heartbreak becomes identity damage, because instead of seeing their avoidance clearly, you start interpreting their withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. You start asking questions no one in pain should have to carry alone. Why was it so easy for them to disconnect? Why wasn't my love enough to make them stay? Why do I still care this much if they can walk away this easily? And those questions can haunt a person for months, sometimes years. But there is something you need to understand right now, something that may hurt to hear, but it will also set you free. Someone's inability to remain emotionally present is not proof that you were hard to love. Read that again in your soul. Their distance is not always a mirror of your value. Sometimes it is simply a mirror of their capacity, their fear, their emotional limits, their conditioning, their defense systems, their inability to sit inside real intimacy without feeling threatened by it. And if you don't understand that, you will spend far too long trying to fix in yourself what was never broken to begin with. This is why this conversation matters so much, because when you are dealing with an avoidant, the most dangerous thing is not always the separation itself. It is misreading the separation. It is telling yourself a story that keeps you emotionally attached to someone who has stopped carrying you in the same way. It is staying loyal to a version of them that no longer exists. It is confusing emotional history with emotional reality. And if you do that long enough, you don't just lose them. You lose your peace, your confidence, your clarity, and eventually your ability to trust your own perception. And that brings us to the hardest truth of all. There is one behavior that changes everything. One shift that tells you this is no longer temporary distance, no longer fear, no longer confusion, but emotional departure. A sign so quiet that most people miss it until they've already wasted months, sometimes years, waiting for someone who was never truly coming back. And that sign is not always dramatic. It is not always cruel. It is not always loud enough to shock you. In fact, that is exactly why so many people miss it. They are waiting for a final argument, a cold confession, a harsh rejection, something obvious enough to force acceptance. But with avoidance, the clearest answer often arrives in the form of something much quieter. They stop being emotionally moved by losing you. That is the shift that changes everything. Because as long as your absence still stirs something inside them, there is still internal conflict. There is still friction. There is still an emotional charge. But when that charge disappears, when your distance no longer creates emotional tension inside their world, you are no longer dealing with confusion. You are dealing with detachment. And that distinction matters more than most people understand. Because many people think an avoidant who acts calm is simply processing privately. They assume the lack of visible emotion means hidden depth. They romanticize the silence. They tell themselves they feel more than they show. And sometimes that is true in the early stages. Sometimes avoidants do care deeply while still struggling to express it. Sometimes they do miss you while resisting contact. Sometimes they do feel torn between love and fear. But there comes a point where the pattern changes. And when it changes, it becomes visible in one brutal way. They no longer behave like losing you cost them anything. That is the part that hurts so deeply. Not because they became angry, not because they fought for distance, but because they became emotionally unaffected. Their energy loses urgency. Their behavior loses contradiction. Their actions lose emotional leakage. They stop reaching out in strange little ways. They stop circling back. They stop creating those confusing moments that once kept your hope alive. There is no tension left in the bond, no push and pull, no sign that separation is disturbing their inner state. And once an avoidant reaches that place, many people make the mistake of calling it maturity or self-control, when in reality it is often full deactivation. And deactivation is not the same as needing space. Needing space still has emotion behind it. Space still carries weight. Space still leaves traces. But deactivation is different. Deactivation is when the avoidant mind starts protecting itself by flattening emotional intensity. It shuts down vulnerability. It numbs attachment cues. It turns connection into pressure and closeness into threat. And once that system fully takes over, they can begin acting like the relationship barely touched them, even if it once meant everything. That is what makes this so psychologically devastating. Because you are still carrying the emotional impact in full color, while they seem to have reduced the entire experience into something muted, distant, and strangely easy to walk away from. That imbalance can break a person, because when you are deeply attached, you naturally assume your absence should matter, not in an ego way, in a human way. If someone shared intimacy with you, opened up to you, made promises to you, held your pain, held your body, held your heart, then your mind believes losing that should leave some visible imprint. It should shake something. It should create some kind of emotional consequence. So when it doesn't, your brain struggles to make sense of it. You begin wondering if any of it was real, if they ever loved you, if you imagined the whole connection, if the closeness only existed because you gave it meaning and they only borrowed it. That is why indifference is often more painful than rejection. Rejection at least gives you something solid. It hurts, but it has shape. It tells you where you stand. Indifference is much crueler because it leaves you emotionally suspended. It makes you feel invisible. It creates a kind of grief that is hard to explain because it is not only about losing someone. It is about feeling like your disappearance failed to register in their world. And for a person who loved deeply, that can feel unbearable because your heart keeps asking a question it cannot stop asking. How can someone once be so close to me and then feel nothing when I'm gone? The answer is not always that they never cared. Sometimes the truth is more uncomfortable than that. Sometimes they cared, but not in a way that gave them the emotional tools to stay connected when intimacy demanded more from them. Sometimes they loved from a distance, but panicked in closeness. Sometimes they enjoyed being wanted, but could not tolerate being needed. Sometimes they were drawn to emotional safety, but terrified of emotional responsibility. And when relationships begin asking for consistency, repair, accountability, or true openness, avoidant patterns often intensify. Not because the connection was meaningless, but because it became too real for the defenses they have spent years building. That is why people get fooled. They think the avoidance withdrawal means they just need more understanding, more patience, more softness, more reassurance. And while compassion is beautiful, there is a dangerous point where compassion turns into self-erasure, because you start over-functioning for a bond that is no longer being emotionally carried by both people. You start doing the emotional labor for two. You become the one holding the memory, the hope, the repair, the meaning, the empathy, the future, and all the while, the other person is becoming more comfortable with your absence than you are with your own loneliness. That should wake something up inside you. Because if someone can lose access to your presence and feel no movement toward reconnection, no instinct to repair, no emotional discomfort strong enough to bring them closer, then what you are waiting for may no longer exist. And this is where many people accidentally destroy themselves. They keep interpreting emotional flatness as hidden depth. They keep waiting for the delayed realization, the late-night message, the sudden breakthrough, the return filled with clarity and remorse. They imagine a day when the avoidant finally feels everything they refused to feel before. And yes, sometimes that happens, but many times it does not. Many times the silence is not building toward a comeback. It is simply proving that they have already adapted to life without you. That is why this sign matters so much, not because it tells you they are evil, not because it proves they are heartless, but because it tells you something essential. You can no longer build your healing around the fantasy that they are secretly fighting for this in the dark. If there is no emotional signal, no behavioral evidence, no meaningful movement, no visible disturbance created by your absence, then continuing to wait is not devotion. It is denial with a romantic soundtrack. And denial always has a price. It costs your peace, your self-respect, your emotional energy, your ability to be present in your own life. It keeps your nervous system locked in a state of anticipation, always scanning for signs, always bracing for a return that may never come. And the longer you stay there, the more you begin abandoning yourself in the name of understanding them. But there is a moment in every painful connection when understanding them too much starts becoming a betrayal of you. And for many people, this is that moment, because distance is not always the deepest wound. Sometimes the deepest wound is realizing that the person you were waiting for no longer feels the emotional gravity of losing you. And once that truth becomes clear, you are left with a decision that changes your life. Keep hoping for movement from someone who has gone emotionally still, or finally face the pain that your heart has been postponing for far too long. And that postponed pain is exactly what keeps so many people trapped. not love, not loyalty, not even the memory of what once felt beautiful. It is the unfinished emotional story, the part of your mind that still believes there must be a final answer hidden somewhere inside the silence, because human beings struggle to let go of what was never fully resolved. The brain can accept loss much faster than it can accept confusion. A painful truth can still heal you, but uncertainty keeps the wound open. It keeps your heart emotionally circling the same closed door, hoping one day it will explain itself. That is why waiting can become addictive. Not because it feels good, but because it keeps feeding the illusion that meaning is still coming. Your mind starts attaching itself to tiny possibilities. One memory, one old conversation, one look they gave you, one time they opened up, one moment when they almost chose vulnerability. And suddenly, instead of looking at the whole pattern, you begin building your emotional future around isolated exceptions. You stop seeing what repeatedly happened and start obsessing over what once happened. That is how people stay emotionally loyal to someone who has already stopped showing up in a real way. And the human mind is incredibly vulnerable to that kind of trap, because when affection has been inconsistent, it often creates stronger attachment, not weaker attachment. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of emotional pain. People think stable love creates obsession. It usually does not. Stability creates peace. It calms the nervous system. It helps the heart feel safe. But inconsistency does something very different. It activates chase. It stimulates uncertainty. It teaches your emotions to stay alert. So if someone gave you warmth, then distance, closeness, then coldness, hope, then absence, your mind may still be trying to solve the emotional puzzle long after the connection has stopped being healthy. And that is not romance. That is survival mode, because when someone keeps pulling away without giving you real closure, your system often starts treating them like an unanswered question that must be solved before you can feel okay again. That is why so many people replay the past in obsessive detail. They reread messages, they analyze timing, they search for hidden meanings in old behavior, they try to identify the exact moment everything changed, as if finding that moment will somehow give them peace. But peace does not come from solving every mystery. Sometimes peace begins the moment you stop demanding perfect understanding from a person who has already shown you emotional unavailability in plain sight. That is the shift most people resist, because deep down, waiting is often not about getting the person back. It is about trying to make the pain make sense. You want their return to rewrite the ending. You want their apology to prove you were not foolish for loving them. You want their clarity to undo the confusion they left inside you. You want some final act that tells your wounded heart, you were not easy to leave. You were not too much. You did matter. And that longing is deeply human. But it can also become deeply destructive when your healing becomes dependent on emotional evidence from someone who has already withdrawn from the responsibility of giving it. That is where self-worth begins to collapse quietly, not all at once, not in a dramatic breakdown, but in subtle, dangerous ways. You start becoming more available to people who are less available to you. You begin tolerating behavior that once would have hurt your dignity. You slowly adjust to emotional neglect until it starts feeling familiar. And the longer you stay in that pattern, the more your standards begin to bend around someone else's limitations. You stop asking whether they are capable of loving you well, and you become obsessed with proving that you are lovable enough to finally unlock them. That pursuit will exhaust your soul, because no matter how patient, kind, understanding, forgiving, emotionally intelligent, or deeply loving you are, you cannot heal someone through your suffering. You cannot love another person into emotional readiness by abandoning your own needs. You cannot earn consistency by over-explaining your value. And you cannot force depth out of someone who only knows how to retreat when real intimacy starts asking them to stay present. That is not how healing works. Real healing never asks one person to carry all the emotional weight while the other disappears behind defense mechanisms and silence. And yet, so many people stay. Not because they are weak, but because pain has a way of distorting loyalty. It makes endurance feel noble. It makes waiting feel meaningful. It convinces you that if you can just hold on a little longer, maybe one day it will all become worth it. But sometimes what you are calling devotion is actually delayed grief. Sometimes what you are calling hope is actually fear of finally accepting what your heart has known for a long time. And sometimes the hardest thing is not losing someone. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting that you have been emotionally alone for much longer than you wanted to believe. That realization can feel devastating because once it hits, you begin seeing the truth with painful clarity. You see how often you were the one reaching, the one repairing, the one trying to keep emotional life inside something that kept growing colder. You see how often you interpreted distance as depth, silence as sensitivity, avoidance as hidden care. You see how much emotional meaning you kept creating to fill the empty spaces they refused to fill themselves. And then the real grief begins. Not only grief for the person, but grief for the version of yourself that kept waiting at a door that was no longer opening. But this is also where your power starts returning. Because once you stop romanticizing emotional absence, you begin seeing your pain differently. You stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" And you start asking the question that actually leads to freedom. Why was I trying so hard to be chosen by someone who kept showing me they were not available for real love? That question changes everything, because it shifts your focus away from their silence and back toward your own wounds, your own patterns, your own hunger to be validated by someone who could not offer what your heart truly needed. And that is not weakness, that is awareness. Awareness is the beginning of emotional freedom. It is the moment you stop treating their return like the answer to your pain. It is the moment you stop building your future around someone else's inability to show up. It is the moment you begin understanding that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is a pattern repeated so many times that your soul finally gets tired of pretending not to understand it. And once that happens, something inside you changes forever, because now you are no longer just grieving the possibility of losing them. Now you are confronting something deeper, the cost of continuing to lose yourself while waiting for someone who has already gone emotionally still. And when that truth finally lands, it forces one of the most important decisions of your life, whether you will keep feeding the wound or finally choose the kind of love that does not require you to disappear just to keep it alive.